in green finance, access to green finance for agri-SMEs. And in this session here, we're going to have a similar format to our last session, with the slight difference that we're going to have a few more speakers involved, but essentially we're going to have a case study presented on the particular focus of this session here, which is about developing partnerships across the science and investor communities. So I'd like to introduce our facilitator for this session, Steffen Entenmann, who's the head of program at GIZ. And I'll let you take it from here to introduce the case study presenters and panelists for this session. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael, and a warm welcome to all of you. It is a great pleasure and honor to facilitate this very interesting and very relevant session. Maybe just one word about how I came involved in that, because it's also a kind of personal honor for me, because we'll be listening to a presentation of a case study from Mauricio Benitez, who is a sectoral specialist at the asset manager, the Swiss-based asset manager responsAbility, and Godefroy Grosjean, who is the global leader for climate action and advisory service at the CGIAR Institute of Biodiversity, CGIAR. So, and I had the pleasure and also honor to embark almost 3 years ago with Mauricio and Godefroy and others to seek for ways how science can really make a fundamental contribution to the development of innovative financial instruments, and really help the financial sectors to reach positive socioeconomic impacts at scale. My apologies that I haven't been able to be from the very start in this session, but we all know that never in history there has this amount of money and assets available for investment, and at the same time there was probably never such a common understanding and determinations amongst investors to invest in activities that can decide financial gains, also socioeconomic impacts. So it is my great pleasure to have a very renowned and professional speakers here. Besides Mauricio and Godefroy, we will also have Matt Haig from the African Enterprise Challenge Fund. He's their monitoring, evaluation and learning advisor, and Morgana Bourggraff, who is a senior board advisor at Innpact, which is a financial advisory firm with an international portfolio also in agricultural SMEs. So my great pleasure, and without further delay, I will pass over to Godefroy and Mauricio. And just some housekeeping rules, maybe. I will have a keen look at the chat, so please use this excessively. And we will, after the presentations, have the possibility to have some question and answers. I cannot promise that we will take all of them, but at least I will try to cluster them and to direct some combined questions to the speakers. So it's up to you, Godefroy and Mauricio. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Steffen, and it's a real pleasure to be here today, and we're very excited to present this partnership we have been developing with different partners, including responsAbility and also with the support from GIZ. So let me just share my screen. Just a second. Can you see it?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay. So it's probably loading. And now, still not?
No, we can't see anything yet.
You
No,
cannot see.
unfortunately not. No.
Okay, because on my screen it's working. Okay, just a second.
Oh, I think something
Okay.
something comes
Working
up.
now.
There we
Yes.
are.
Here we are. Right.
Okay, sorry for that. Yes, so I will be presenting together with Mauricio. So it will be a bit of a back and forth between the two of us, really present some of the joint work, but also the joint thinking we've been doing with responsAbility in the last year or even more than that. So let me just start by briefly introducing ourselves a bit more, just to give you a bit more background of where we come from and what we're bringing or we intend to bring to the partnership and to the fund that we will present today. So the CGIAR, as you may know, is the largest partnership on agricultural research globally, and we now have for quite some time we started working on sustainable finance with the idea and the objective to really harness our science and innovation capacities to reorient and leverage capital flows toward innovative investment in sustainable food, land, and water systems transformation. So that's really, like our mantra and objective, and why we decided to create a sustainable finance team dedicated to that. The starting point of this has been touched upon by the previous speakers to a great extent, but let me just mention that quickly, just to link with our work. But so we all seeing key challenges in the transformation of food systems, and what we see is that there is a massive funding gap. So about 300 to 350 billion a year are missing to transform food and land systems. And this is to a certain degree or to a large degree linked to limited pipeline of bankable projects. There are very few projects that are large enough to be attractive to investors. There is and there is just, it's not a problem of capital availability globally, but just not enough capital being deployed in food systems. At the same time, we also observe that when you look specifically at smallholder farmers, and that's one of also the mandate of SAFIN, specifically there is a big gap there. About 180 or close to 190 billion are missing to help smallholder farmers increase their productivity, but also respond to climate risk and climate change. Why is that? Again, discussed partly before, but high investment risk or attractive risk-adjusted return. So that was mentioned previously, but also specifically a lack really of primary data on the sector, on specific value chains, on agri-SMEs, especially in developing countries, and to a great extent, asymmetric information, which makes it very difficult for investors to, with reasonable transaction costs, to invest into the sector. And finally, what we also see is that about only 10 billion of ODA goes into agriculture, forestry, and fishing each year. Of that, a very tiny share, I think about 350 million, goes to blended finance instruments, and there is a real lack of intermediation. Connecting different pools of capital to investments, and this is due again to lack of standardized methods to assess investment risk, investment impacts. There is a lack of aggregation. I mentioned that before. Limited matchmaking existing between investors and potential investees, and not enough funding going into blended finance instruments. So Now, having said that, what we intend to do as an organization, and again, that's a key objective of that specific partnership that we present today, is really to use our science and our presence on the ground, having been working for decades in developing countries with smallholder farmers to address some of the challenges that I mentioned before. So, and we will do that, and we are already doing that across three sort of key sort of impact approach. One is really to design innovative investment solutions and vehicles to catalyze private capital, and we will present today a very specific example of that. But to be involved in the design and make sure the design incorporates our science and that, so that through our scientific tools, methods, and so on, we can make sure that we maximize the impact the investments or those investment solutions will have. The second pillar is about scaling innovation and accelerating the development of digital solutions. So here it's on one hand more in the early stage supporting innovators that have the ability to really reach those farmers that we haven't been able to reach sufficiently until now. So developing innovative solutions for providing, for instance, finance or facilitating finance, access to finance for farmers, but also very much looking on the advisory side, using digital tools to provide better agro-advisory to farmers, provide better information and advise them and accompany them in what they do to better respond to climate risk. So, but in addition to that, it's also about using our tools and data sets and digital solutions to reduce the transaction cost, to deploy investment into food systems. We said many times today transaction costs are big issues, but there are solutions, for instance, using remote sensing that could be designed or that are already being designed to reduce the monitoring costs, or using the data sets that we have to facilitate assessing the impact, and I come to of a certain investment, and I will discuss that in a minute in more detail. And finally, we really work on market intelligence for sustainable finance. So this is about providing actors in the sustainable finance ecosystem with better information on market trends, but also taking into consideration, for instance, climate impact. So what will be the 10, 20 years impact of climate change on a certain value chain in a certain country and on that markets on the markets in these countries. So to facilitate risk assessment, reduce the asymmetric information, and that's like again one of the area we're active on, and we'll present in more details in a second. So now I pass the floor to Mauricio, and then I will come back after that. Mauricio, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Godefroy. So it's a pleasure to be here again at in Safin. So it's I think this is the second time that I'll present our initiative here. So I think, Godefroy, you are exited.
Yeah, but sorry, there is a problem. I cannot mute myself. But anyways, please go ahead.
Yeah. So we have. Yeah, and I've been with responsAbility for 12 years, and so just briefly, we entered the food and agriculture space in 2005, 2 years after our foundation. So we launched a dedicated vehicle for agriculture investments in 2011, for which I was promoted to manage the portfolio. With this fund, we targeted improved rural livelihoods as main impact theme, and we have provided mainly working capital loans and technical assistance in organic farming to SMEs worldwide. These SMEs normally source from smallholder farmers. Since then, you can see we have reached about 350,000 farmers and work with about 250 SMEs. So how we normally work is one example is that we have featured recently is in Cambodia. Out of these examples, they tell there's different stories, but in essence, we start with them relatively small, aggregating 100 farmers. We identified growth potential, and then after 8 years, providing working capital loan, a term loan, and technical assistance, they tend to reach about 10,000 farmers. Like in this case in Cambodia, they reach an interesting size of 50 million, let's say, in sales. So we can accompany this growth over 8 years, and for ours, that is impact scale and improving agricultural practices. We provide, again, not only loans, but technical assistance. And good to highlight is that, yes, we have done about 100 million in long-term loans with a really relatively good track record for the industry. Is there where we have financed, we have identified a financing gap. It's a long-term growth capital in emerging markets for SMEs. We take the same example of this rice processor in Cambodia. They needed to grow from 100 farmers to 10,000. They needed a capacity increase, and that is not available in local markets. Now that rice processor in Cambodia doesn't need working capital loans, but they still need long-term capital. And next slide, please, Godefroy. So here, just to explain, once identified that market gap, how we started to work with this CGIAR. So yes, back in 2019, we identified that just the value chain approach and the improved rural livelihoods with more productivity as a, let's say, as an impact theme was not enough in the current context. In 2019, the IPCC report said that the climate change will, the food system is one of the main drivers of climate change, and just the food system could lead us to reach our budget for the Paris Agreement by 2050. So we needed to change our approach. So we coordinated with the CGIAR and Godefroy and others on how to mainstream climate change to a new fund that targets long-term investments in emerging markets. We come from climate finance as well. We have about $1 billion invested in renewable energy and energy efficiency, so something that we do well. But the overlap is something that we were targeting a new fund, climate finance and sustainable food. So as Godefroy mentioned, from the beginning we wanted a science-based fund, because climate finance you really need to measure, and from the beginning you need to be involved in the design, how to measure this. These are the KPIs and the tools early in the process, and we're embedding that process in how we do investments. So sourcing and screening, we will basically incorporate their tools that we have developed with the CGIAR that Godefroy will present later. This tool will guide us on the screening and preliminary assessment of investments. Those tools are very innovative, and they will allow investment officers to really assess, well, this SME has the potentiality to address our KPIs. During the due diligence, we will not only do the, let's say, usual financial assessments, the investment officers will do that, but also the impact assessment in this case will have a component of climate risk, biodiversity risk, but also the food systems framework. So in the case of the rice processor, and it will not be just organic that we need to support in this case, because as you know, rice contributes to 10% of climate GHG emissions in APAC. So a food system framework will be incorporated in the due diligence. In the investment decision, we will have let's say once approved, a baseline that will be applied to all investments. That baseline will apply, and we will see the KPIs later, not only on GHG emissions, but also on water productivity, soil health, and food loss and waste. That baseline is key for the science-based measurement that comes later post-investment. Post-investment is not only measuring and monitoring, but is also providing technical assistance for implementing climate smart interventions identified pre-investment. So pre-investment, again, going back a bit, is as important as post-investment for the TA package. And lastly, we will, of course, report on these KPIs and quarterly and annually. All this process has been designed from the very beginning in collaboration with CGIAR, and is embedded, let's say, in the both investment process, but also on the impact process. So Godefroy, back to you. So we are still within 15 minutes, let's say.
Thanks a lot, Mauricio, and let me move the slide. Okay, so basically, yeah, thanks Mauricio for giving this very nice overview of the process. Given the time constraints, what I want to do is to explain a bit more our role, as a scientific organization in that process, and the type of, to get a bit concrete as well, the type of work and tools that we're developing. So, I mean, from the very beginning, as Mauricio said, we worked together on developing the theory of change and developing an impact and monitoring framework. So the theory of change is really intends, as outcome to provide solutions to investors to manage risks, increase efficiency per product, and scale climate smart practices, and demonstrate investment viability to catalyze more capital. So those are the key outcomes that we intend to achieve, and that will be also interesting to come back to that later in the discussions. Now, from there, we moved into developing the KPIs, and I will come back to that in a second in more details. But based on those KPIs that we developed together with responsAbilities, and that were very much aligned with the thinking around climate smart agriculture, looking at tackling mitigation, but also adaptation and productivity, and having KPIs across those three pillars of CSA. So that was really one of the starting points, CSA, but also from a food systems point of view, and that was very much reflected in our thinking from the beginning. So we designed different tools that will help us in that process to build pipeline, to assess the potential impact in the early stage, and to be able to really make sure that the investments, and that includes also public funded, this is a blended instrument, will maximize its impact in terms of the KPIs that we mentioned. So here, let me just very quickly mention two tools that we have been working on. One is really an impact scoring tool that helps, basically we build a set of questions that we can ask potential investee. And that helps us directly assessing what will be the impact across those three pillars, but also potential additionality elements. Is there potential for TA to come in to reach out a lot of smallholder farmers on the ground? Is there the potential for additional finance there? So we look at a series of parameters to at the end, define, of course, go, no-go options, and then some options in between that may require a bit more investigation. But that really, is one of the first steps to build the pipeline. We're applying that at the moment in different geographies, refining that tool and making sure it's a tool that is not developed just by scientists thinking of what an investor might need, but that it's co-developed with investors to really make sure the parameters that are used in that tool are actually useful also within an investment process. Then once there is a pre-selection, we want to be able to basically impact the the potential to assess, the potential impact of the investments. And that's, again, that's, you know, that can require a lot of work, and we realize that once you're building the pipeline, you need to have an initial tools that can help you very quickly assess and quantify the potential impact before moving more into the due diligence and more detailed studies. So we used, you know, existing data sets, combined them, and we are in the process of finalizing the development of that tool, which really helps you, you know, select a certain value chain, rise, for instance, a certain stage of the value chain. And by the way, the investment can be, you know, production, but it can be either one stage of the value chain or several stages of the value chain. You know, looking at the hectares that it can, you know, target. For instance, if you work with an agri-SMEs and their sourcing area, you will look at, you know, how many hectares they source from and how many farmers, so smallholder farmers, they could reach. You know, making some easy assumption around the adoption rate, and then directly you get a sort of quantification of the potential for potential impact of that investment. And that really reduces, you know, some of the initial steps of building the pipeline and trying to look at investments that maximize the impact. So those are really tools that are built in the work. We will provide STA to the fund. It's funded by donor, and our role is really to build that for the fund, but again, to make sure that this can, you know, help more generally in the future the industry and reduce transaction costs when it comes to building the pipeline and designing investments into the sector. Now, very quickly, and probably don't need to go into the details of that, but just to highlight the sort of KPI. So, I mean, we focus on mitigation. We all know the importance of food systems in terms of contributing to greenhouse gas emissions, but also in terms of emission reduction potential, as Mauricio mentioned. So we will look at reduction in terms of net CO2 emissions. In terms of secondary impacts, of course, it has cost saving for investees. It helps access to clean, reliable power. It can also have impact, less impact on local water quality and biodiversity when you look at fertilizers and use and so on. So mitigation, that's you know, one of the core components. On the adaptation side, we will very much look at water productivity and soil health. And that's quite important. Of course, adaptation matrix can be very broad. Here we selected to a narrow set of metrics, but that we think are very essential, because there is, of course, and that's again something to discuss perhaps later, but always a trade-off between, you know, like finding robust and metrics and KPIs that can be measured, but also not, you know, having expanding too much to an extent that the transaction cost of the investment becomes, you know, too high or prevent the investment to happen in the first place. So, and then when it comes to productivity, it will have a strong focus on food loss and waste, how to reduce that across the value chain, given that about a third of the world's food is lost or wasted every year. So there is massive potential to reduce that, and that's what we will intend to do and also quantify through our work with responsAbility. So I stop here, and I very much look forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much, Godefroy and Mauricio. Yeah, there's definitely a lot to say about this very, very nice overview where you showcased in which different parts of the process science can make an important contribution. But of course, I would rather invite Morgana right now as a speaker and representative of Innpact, who is also involved, I assume, in the design of investment vehicles. And I just would like to invite you to give your feedback or your personal comments on this presentations, and maybe, of course, with a specific focus on the added value of science. So do you also think that in the future there can't be any impact investment vehicle without the contribution of science, or how do you see it?
Yeah, thanks, Steffen. No, so thank you both for the really interesting presentation. One of the thoughts that I had in mind listening to you is really on where in these kinds of investment funds you're actually applying this science and innovation. I know in your objective you state that it's to harness science and innovation to reorient and leverage capital flows towards innovative investments. But it seems to me that a lot of the science and innovation is really on the impact management side, and kind of on monitoring the portfolio itself, but not necessarily investing specifically in science and technology. Or did I misunderstand? No?
How do we do? Do we respond directly, or we take a few comments first?
Morgana, if you have another point,
okay,
then I think we can combine them, yes.
Yeah, sure. So the point, maybe responding, Steffen, to your question is, yeah, I think in the future of impact finance, and specifically in agriculture and food systems finance, maybe it's not the case right now. We see, obviously, as everyone here knows, a lot of discussions in the market on kind of coordinating on all of the different indicators and how we're actually measuring the impact of these investments, and how we're measuring, you know, what the delta is at the end of the day is the real impact. But I do think that going forward, of course, having this science-based starting point is really going to be considered the bare minimum, because of course if we want to actually be doing something net good, we need to be applying real, tangible metrics to it.
Okay. Yeah, please respond to the very important question.
Yeah, thanks, Morgana. And that's an excellent question. And I would say from our point of view, from the CGIAR point of view, definitely both. So in that specific case, it's true that a lot of the sort of science innovation I've discussed is on the, you know, impact assessment, but also looking at, you know, identifying the best practices to maximize, you know, the impact of the investments and so on, because the fund is a debt fund that will target to a great extent agri-SMEs. And work with their you know, value chain and try to maximize the impact through that. Now within the CGIAR, we also, you know, working on other programs where we involve. There is, for instance, a program called Accelerate for Impact platform, where we really you know, try to support early stage innovators. And you know, and not just the traditional incubation or acceleration program that already exists, but to match early stage innovators with scientists, so that when needed, the innovations can be improved by bringing science into it. For instance, you know, if you develop an app to provide agro advisory to farmers, right? You could bring CGIAR scientists and match them with this innovator to have a much stronger climate angle, and you know, we do a lot of work on climate services. So we definitely moving towards doing both, because I fully agree with you, both are complementary and very important. But yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And then I would like to invite Matt. I guess you could also speak a little bit on behalf of the SMEs, who unfortunately were not fully included in this session, which would have been good as well to capture their perception. But I figured that you could adapt their perspective and maybe bring this into your responses to this to the presentation.
Yeah, sure, Steffen, and hello everybody. My name is Matt Haig. I'm not Victoria Sabula, so if you came here to see her, my apologies for. She's in a meeting with the minister, and when the minister asks, you attend. ACF is a concessional finance provider into agri and renewable clean energy SMEs in Africa. We work in about 20 different countries, and I wanted to just make this connection between sort of science and SMEs. On one hand, we invest, a lot of the enterprises we invest in are enterprises that are set up by scientists or come out of science institutions. And we've had specific investment funds that actually reach into institutions to find unfunded innovative ideas that we can bring to market. But the main part is I think around this linking science with the way that the processes are working on the investment side. And if you look at what we have to do as a funder, we're going in and working with science. And when I say science, I mean both consultants and also sort of scientists from institutions. We need people to go in and work in a very diverse range of different environments. So our SMEs are based all over Africa in many different contexts. And we very much have a focus on working with local advisors and scientists who can bring that sort of that cultural and that communication context. So we're working with them very much at the beginning of the process, from even defining our investment structures, right the way through the due diligence, and then providing that kind of technical assistance. So our investees are really after two forms of advisory support, I would say, once they've reached us, once they're on our books. And we provide sort of essentially returnable capital, but in ticket sizes of somewhere around 200,000 to 1.5 million. So our investees are really after two things. One is investment facilitation and getting money. I mean, we are one part of the stage of financing continuum. And the second part is that business support TA. You know, especially these SMEs, they're often owner managers, so they have a lot of issues around putting in place a lot of that operational organizational structures that they need to be able to scale until they come up into the kind of bigger ticket items that we're talking about with your fund. So that's really the areas where we would like to see science and the SMEs come together. So I suppose my question to you would be around the provision of things like business advisory assistance and getting access to finance. And then perhaps one final point, when we're working with all of these investees, obviously we're bringing people in from all over the continent to provide us with advisory support, and it's an expensive process. So anything that we can do to come up with more sort of common and standard, not just metrics. I mean, we work with people like Gogler and some of the Gene, of course, on using their common metrics, but common tools, common assessment tools and things like that during the selection and due diligence processes are always really useful for the kind of needs that we have. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you very much. I just played the ball back to Godefroy and Mauricio. I think an important question, what triggered me in that case was the business support. If I might add to that, maybe you can respond also to that. So how can you support business, but also in achieving the development goals, or does this also go together? This might be something a question I could also play back to Matt as well. And so how does business go together with the socio-economic development and SDG goals we want to achieve? Is this automatic link or not? So sorry, I'm again changing my head and give it back to Godefroy and Mauricio.
Mauricio, you want to start, or should I go ahead? Okay, yeah, very quickly, good question, Steffen, and I think there is I would say simple answer, but I'm largely exaggerating here. But you know, the concept of, let's say, CSA, climate smart agriculture, has always been to look at opportunities where you basically have synergies between, you know, productivity on one hand, because it's hard to convince smallholder farmers, but any, you know, private entity for that matter, to do something that you know, hurts the productivity, but that also we look where a synergistic approach, where basically you have a positive impact on productivity, and at the same time you reduce you know, your emissions, you reduce and you become more resilient, and you know, we constantly doing within the CGIAR sort of cost-benefit analysis of this type of CSA interventions and so on. And it's clear that there is very often a business model, or it makes sense from a business point of view to invest in these. You have many interventions that can be done that will increase productivity, will improve livelihoods, but that have positive sort of impacts when it comes to the SDGs. So I don't see this really as trade-offs or the need to have trade-offs between the two. I think that there has been plenty of research that shows that you can very often in the agricultural sector achieve both. And then our role, of course, is to find within a certain context, within a certain value chain, what are those interventions that are synergistic across those pillars. Mauricio, you want to add to that?
Yes, well, as an impact investor, first and foremost is granted we finance growth. So growth is the first parameter of what we are looking for in a project. So as said, our experience is that a success intervention brings from 100 farmers to 10,000 farmers. That means that the agribusiness grew from 1 million in sales or less to, in this case, 40-50 million. So that is a certain win. What we want to incorporate with this fund is that we need a nuanced and pragmatic move from just organic to more regenerative practices to improve soil health. That will target our KPI on soil health. That will also add soil carbon, and something that we can measure. So we have, during the engagement with that company, we have 5 to 7 years to really do that. And that the partnership with CGIAR will help us. So this is the project, this is the financing. So how can we work with 10,000 farmers? We know how to work with infrastructure, for example. So infrastructure is really relatively easy. We have advocated already for cleaner energy in infrastructure. Renewable energy and energy efficiency. That is, you can really show that over the long run, that's more profitable. We have advocated already and implemented reduce loss, output. So that's something also economically logical. So that yes, I see less loss, more money. What we need to do now is advocate for a nuanced and pragmatic, again, move towards more regenerative. It's not that way you will move farmers from conventional to regenerative, because that's not real, but you can really do it in a way that you can increase soil health gradually. And even if you increase soil carbon from 1 to 2%, 3 to 4, let's say, depending on the baseline, that's very significant on 300,000 hectares, right? So that's more or less that where we come from when we want to finance these growth companies.
Okay. Well, thank you very much so far. I started to look at the incoming questions in the chat, and I think there is one from Thierry, which can be, I think, responded on the point. I guess I would like to direct to Godefroy, which is, I mean, yeah, you mentioned your capacity to work with data and data. To analyze data and derive information for investors for them. So, but the question here is, of course, if we don't have so much data, what is then your comparative advantage? Or would in that case, maybe another form of consultancy not be more suitable in case of few data?
That's an excellent question, and a difficult one. I mean, and the reality in food systems and agriculture, especially in developing countries, you often have this, the lack of data availability. I mean, that happens very often. So we have, our approach to that is, of course, first to try to rely on our existing data sets that we have built over the years, being present in many geographies. But in addition to that, they will need to be, to a certain degree, presence on the ground or third-party verification. And our role is not necessarily to go ourselves and collect data everywhere, but rather identify the local partners we can work with, and we develop more the M&E framework, the approach, the methodology, and then this can be applied also by others we work with, depending on the circumstances, to keep the costs reasonable. Now, the third point I want to mention is that there are more and more tools, thinking about remote sensing, for instance, that can be used to, and cost of access is very low. And that's where, again, science comes. Can we use those solutions to reduce transaction costs in a data scarce situation? And that's, I think, where organizations like ours, have a role to play, and try from their experience working with this kind of data to provide, in sort of medium-term public goods that can be available by the broader community to respond to that challenge. And that, I think, also is a response to Bettina's question, right? Yes, at the beginning, because this is an innovative sort of fund instruments that we're designing, and there is inevitably transaction costs that are linked to that in the early stage, and that's where the blended finance component comes in, and where we need donors to support that and to develop those kind of tools and methodologies, but with the understanding that the idea is that with time those tools are used by a broader set of actors, and you reduce you make them available, and you reduce the transaction cost inherent to this kind of instruments.
Thank you very much, Godefroy. Thank you also for starting to respond to Bettina's question. I think this is a very important one, and I sense that also from the comments from Morgana and Matt. And also we realized this when we proposed this model, where we have like a scientific organization to the donor community, and we were asked frequently, so what is the additional value here of the science community? Why don't you go with consultants that have maybe a more better understanding of business related problems and so on? And I think this is, yeah, I would once more give this question back, because I think that is really at the heart of this session, linking science and investment vehicles. Morgana, once more, you already touched on this before, but under which conditions you would team up with a large scientific organizations like CGIAR and not go with a consultant that has a very short-term engagement, but maybe more specific to the specific problem?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think here one of the things that it really comes down to is sort of this question of innovation. And I don't want to describe anyone too blanketly, but of course, going with the consultants who have this more experience, as you were saying, on the field, you're really going to be getting measurements that are kind of what we have already. And as everyone knows, I mean, there's a lot of problems with the way we're measuring things now. There's a lot of confusion among investors. And so having a real firm science-based approach to this is something that would be really interesting. What I actually, looking at the comments from Bettina and also this question from Michael, I can see having really a partner in the scientific community being very interesting in kind of the concept development of a fund, where you really have kind of a science-based target approach, looking at where is our money really going to be making the most impact, and using the scientific community to be able to determine these things. So like, for example, when earlier I was looking at the slides on adaptation, and I think it would be really interesting to kind of leverage some of the knowledge and research of the scientific community to see where the focus really needs to be put. That way, we're really creating the most possible impact. I tend to have this really utilitarian form of mind, the most good with the least harm. And I think that's something where the data from the scientific community would be really useful.
Okay. Matt?
If I may, Steffen,
Sure.
Yeah,
Mauricio, go ahead.
Yeah, we enter normally certain sectors, and I said it already 2-3 times to bring it to scale. So that's the goal. Otherwise, for us as an asset manager, it's not really attractive to have small vehicles or something that you do it just once. But yes, for something that is innovative, you tend to do a closed-ended fund that is blended, so that you target with our track record, we show the risks, but also we can target the perceived risks. So that's why we have the blended structure, close-ended, so we can prove, let's say, that there's a track record during the next 10 years, and then replicate. We have seen from the past 5 years that climate was something that promoters, SMEs, they were not really defining in their growth plans. They were not interested. More like, let's say, 5 years ago, 4 years ago, we have seen that they're really interested in renewable energy and efficiency. Why? Because I said makes sense. I mean, you just advocate the costs over 10 years and they really get it. The same is with food loss. We honestly believe that the same will happen towards regenerative agriculture. Again, nuanced and pragmatic. Nothing totally that it only works in the south of France. But so that's we believe that the intentionality is there. We have been working with again backward integrated retail and food companies that they are already working with the farmers on that. And so this fund, we believe that it could be escalated without those transaction costs, that the CGIAR will leave that legacy, that it can be measured without all that TA, really intensive TA, that is pre-assessment in this case, also the advocacy, working with the companies, and then post-assessment, that is the monitoring. It will be just integrated. That's our bet, and that's what the trend that we have seen, that there's intentionality, but now there's the adoption of climate in financing the projects. It's growing. So again, hopefully we will not need TA for the next fund to make this grow. Have a food systems framework, let's say.
Okay. So thank you very much, Mauricio. And I would once more invite Matt for the pro and cons of the scientific organization into such instruments, and maybe if I may add the question, how important do you think the potential of this scientific organizations like CGIAR, bringing in also new innovations and linking the innovations they have developed in the form of CSA, for example, but also any kind of management practice. How easy is it for the farmers, in your experience, to adapt to that and use it as a way to aggregate value in order to be more competitive or more resilient?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of things to cover. One is around costs. So obviously, when we're putting together an investment facility, we have a certain budget for the provision of advisory support, whichever form it's coming in. And I think there's an increasing emphasis around, I suppose you call it, right-sizing research. And one of the issues when working with more sort of formal academic institutions is that they very much like to do very robust research, which is tremendously expensive. And I think there's a much more of a move.
I think we're losing you. I think we lost you.
You unmuted me. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I think there's a move very much, and we certainly do it towards more lean data approaches for both impact measurement, but also getting information around how we want to be looking at designing and setting up funds. And so I think cost is a very significant issue. In the past, we have collaborated with formal research institutions, and some of the issues that we find is difficult because we're operating across so many different contexts. To find an organization that has the ability to sort of respond to you in a significant manner. We have found it successful where we work in a specific field, and it is something that we will be doing again, working with an institution that aligns with the sort of things that we want. So an organization that has perhaps has a scientific background in a certain technical area, but wants to break into the private sector, or wants to do more work with the private sector. And I think here it's very important that we make sure that the expectations of both sides are aligned, and the relationship doesn't just turn into us funding the research institution. And so that's something that I think it takes a lot to get going. And then in terms of how do these changes cascade down to the farmer level? And I think it's a really important point. And as Mauricio was saying, if you can go in and show that people are going to make money, and you can really unpack all of that, then it becomes sort of a no-brainer and an easy sell. Because we give highly concessional financing, we have to make sure that what we do offers more than just those obvious financial wins, right? So we're talking about trying to explain to our SMEs how gender inclusion leads to positive sort of benefits for them on a number of different levels over time. And I think that's an area where more tools and more mechanisms which CGIAR can develop, and we can integrate not just into our systems, but into sort of the community level systems, because there's lots of us doing the same sort of thing, and we all have the same sort of needs. If we can develop those systems and work with organizations that exist already, Godefroy, for example, I've said before, is an organization that we work closely with, then we can start this process that we've been speaking about all day of coming up with more standardized understanding of how to measure impact, and that will reduce all of our costs. But I mean, our main aspect is engaging with the SMEs themselves. We find that they obviously understand very well the people that they work with. So we're talking about SMEs that work with farmers either as producers of goods or as consumers of products that they sell. So they understand those people very well, and that's an ideal route down into those markets. But it takes a very long time. First, you have to convince the SME that this is appropriate, and then they have to find ways of addressing sort of cultural, economic, social resistances to these ideas at the local level. And that's difficult, and that's what we don't really have a lot of funding for. And I would see something like tools from CGIAR to help us through our facilitators, the SMEs. That would be incredibly useful from our side.
Okay, thank you very much. We are almost we are approaching the end of this session. I think we started a bit later, so I take liberty to forward one more question from Eduardo to Godefroy, because this is also connects very well to what Matt just said, translating research outcomes for the users. And the question of Eduardo is, well, and also to Mauricio, whether this fund is based on new science for whether I think the sense of this question is whether the science that is used in the TA for the fund, for example, can be really translated to the different types of farmers and make them also put them in a position to take up the finance.
I understand the question,
Yeah.
Steffen, as if the fund will also finance AgTech,
Right.
And yes, so 75% will be where we come from. These agribusinesses that can allow to reach a large number of smallholder farmers, and let's say positively screening shifting to sustainable diets, healthier diets. So that's 75%. But the other 25% we want to do precisely that, act tech, but not develop new science, but the technology solutions that are out there already supporting the system to become sustainable. That's hermetic bags, for example, to reduce food loss to a minimum, or the management solutions for farmers for adopting technologies in climate smart agriculture. So those are examples that need to be scaled up. And the fund will not only do that, but also, for example, silvopasture agroforestry systems in Colombia, milk producers, they want to switch to European breeds and they need shade. So those kind of innovations we want to do, but up to 25%. The rest needs to be, again, it needs to be a balanced risk return for investors. But the size of the fund will allow us to do 25% interesting aspects, and the support of the CGIAR will be key, because these two new fields are relatively new to us.
Okay, thank you very much, Mauricio, also for reinterpreting the question. There's quite a lot in this question, because this is also conveys the questions about small scale farmers and that require different types of financing, which is probably also a very important point when we speak about impact investment and reaching small and medium enterprises. Also with my background with development policy, and I know that these vulnerable groups have to be targeted as well, but these are probably not the vulnerable small scale farmers are probably not the actors that can reach more very easily by these kinds of instruments, as we have also seen. And also the Climate Smart Food System Fund is also not targeting small scale farmers, but rather the larger as MEs, not the smaller SMEs. But I think that is something very important, I guess, where also the socioeconomic knowledge and social scientific knowledge of the CGIAR can play a very, very important role. That would be great to discuss another time. So I think we did a great job in identifying challenges of these cooperations between investment world and the scientific world, and very important first steps and how to overcome these gaps between perceptions and language, but also overall thinking. And again, congratulations that for presenting this case study where which really shows that this is possible, but it also requires a lot of work and a lot of persistence, I would say. So thank you everybody for joining, and thank you very much to the panelists for this very good discussions. And I just encourage you to take a break, a well-deserved break, of course, but then come back to the session, because there will be a brainstorming session, and I'm sure Michael will fill you in after the break. So 6 to 10 minutes break, I would say, and then we meet here again. Thank you very much from my side. All the best. Bye.
Where the main difference with the previous sessions is that we are now going to split participants up into 3 separate groups. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to answer some key questions that come up around the theme of partnerships and access to finance for agri-SMEs. And so this doesn't focus so much on the type of partnerships, but some of the questions surrounding any type of partnerships. So specifically in terms of the 3 topics that are going to be addressed. The first is around how partners can come together to consider what green means, and what green means for them within their partnership initiative. The second is around aligning metrics and reporting systems in these types of green finance partnerships. And the final one is around the determination of bankability criteria. So these all link to some of the topics that have come up through discussions in the two previous sessions. And allocation of participants to these rooms is going to be based as much as we can on the preference that you might have selected ahead of time. So each of these rooms is going to be facilitated by a specialist who will be in the first one on the definition of green, Andrea Nowak from who's a consultant in climate smart agriculture at CGIAR. The second one is which is more on the metrics and the alignment of metrics and reporting systems, is going to be facilitated by Richard Newman, who's a senior sustainable finance specialist at CGIAR. And the final one on bankability criteria is going to be facilitated by Tamer El Raghi, who's the managing director of the Acumen Resilient Agriculture Fund, or ARAF. So I think we can all be split up now if we can create those rooms.
Maria Luisa? Dimmi cara. Vuoi metterti da qualche parte? Non ti ho assegnato a nessuna stanza. Se c'è bisogno di qualcuno che registra, sì. Sì, se hai bisogno di qualcuno che registra, sì, posso registrare col mio, perché con l'altro sono fuori controllo.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the main room. I hope you all had some constructive discussions in each of your breakout rooms. What we're going to do now in minutes or so, try to go through, well, I'll be asking to try to share some of the key points that they noted from their sessions in under 2 minutes, if possible. So I will go and I propose to go in order of the rooms as we have it here, with Andrea Novak going first for room 1.
Thank you, Michael. Can I kindly ask Bettina to help me with projecting, with sharing the screen with the questions? I managed to take a few notes, but I think it would be super helpful to have them on screen. So yeah, but I could start in the meantime, just say, so our group discussed green partnerships and what the green means in the partnerships. So we started by trying to dig a bit into the best practices that could be considered to direct the finances, whether labels or frameworks or regulations or taxonomies. And there were a couple of key insights that stood out relative to the simplification of the models available and of the approaches available. The fact that there are a lot of frameworks and taxonomies out there, and there isn't a universal or set standard that investors or partners in general could focus on. Some bringing some order to this universe and simplifying them would be a key priorities. And another maybe thing I would highlight here is that adaptation and resilience and small-scale agriculture investments often are not captured well under available taxonomies. The second question was really about how to define objectives and priorities, like what areas of green would partners focus on, whether on ESGs, whether on more on the social side, more on adaptation or mitigation, waste management, and so on. And we had an interesting discussion about the need to have a multiple objectives portfolio where you don't only focus on one objective, but on multiple ones, because this would allow you to look at different scales and also at different types of investments. And some types of investors would not see adaptation alone as green enough, especially large institutional investors with specific policies and commitments related to mitigation in their portfolios. And lastly, we really tried to dig a bit into the principles and approaches for ensuring that partnerships really work in the best interest of ag SMEs. So we discussed roles. I think like we had an interesting discussion around the roles of incentives. So providing ag SMEs not just with the finance, but also with access to information, with evidence that certain types of investments bring certain types of benefits and costs. We also talked about the need to focus on the clients. So this is another very important principle. And last but not least, to focus on the local food system and value chains, because this is where the ag SMEs are more connected and are directly linked with the farmers. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much for that concise recap, Andrea. If I can move now to room 2 with Richard Newman on the question of aligning metrics and reporting systems.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I'm sure we can all agree that this is one of the most widely discussed and also contentious topics at the moment. How do we actually go about aligning the metrics, right? Yeah, so we had a really good discussion. We broke it down to 3 questions, which we tried to address. We firstly looked at existing resources or frameworks that are out there. The good news is there is quite a lot. So there are those resources that we can leverage and iterate and work off. For example, Gold Standards explained already this afternoon that they're doing a lot on the certification, which is quite extremely important and needed. Then we have, for example, IRIS looking at generally accepted standards, and then we have climate disclosure standard boards, a range of different players out there. So the good news is there are those, and we should really leverage that. The main point there came out was that we need to balance the standardization requirement with also the regional and local value chain differences, right? It's not the same if you're looking at an investment in Brazil versus Burkina Faso. So somehow we need to balance the two to get to more harmonized metrics, which we all seek. Then on the second point, we discussed the experiences from the group, how they have been applying metrics. The main question was, or the main feedback there was that it is quite challenging. It involves quite a number of different stakeholders and different type of investors. They all seek different reporting requirements. And then if you look from climate mitigation to biodiversity to adaptation, a whole range of different metrics can apply. I think the main discussion out there was there was a lot of progress, and we spoke through some examples, and we'd happily share those with the wider group. There was also a call to align metrics more closely with incentives for accountability, both the incentives to reach for the farmer, but also to the corporates, right? So if we can align our metrics to really incorporate these incentives, that would be really good. We also discussed on alignment of the collection of the data. So at this stage, it's all being done each investor is doing it there by themselves. However, if we can really rather coordinate more closely together, we can really drop that cost and really use that data more, improve that data collection. And then the last point was on the costs, and I guess I touched on this, but data collection is very expensive, not just data collection, but monitoring and evaluating, and who should bear that cost. There's a lot of work being done in terms of remote sensing and research organizations, which we spoke through. But there were also some interesting points, is that how better can we use that data, right? It should not just be for the reporting of the metrics, but also feed that back into for the benefit of the end user or the smallholder farmer, or to anyone else that can use the data. So how better can we make use of that data was the main point. And also bundling that with, for example, climate information services. So a lot of interesting points that came up in our discussion. Yeah, I hope I made the 2 minutes, but I think that is a summary from my side.
No, but that was great. It sounds like you definitely covered a lot of ground in your session, and that's really great to hear. So I'll move now to the last room, facilitated by Tamara El-Raghi, on the question of determining bankability criteria.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And actually, in our room, we had a very engaging and insightful discussion, and we have touched also on farmers. And we always talk about companies, but also farmers need to make money and become sustainable as well. So we talked about how we should focus on measurable adaptation at the farm level in any investment criteria. If we are talking about green financing, we also talked about how to focus on how to make sure that those farmers benefit, so that they become an essential part of the sustainability of the benefit of the business. So farmers need to become profitable and sustainable, and also aligning the understanding of what green means in practice to smaller farmers versus end consumers, like supporting small farmers to address hurdles that typically inhibit their access to finance. We also, which of course that involves a lot of behavior change, and behavior change is expensive. So we talked about the use of TA money to drive that behavior change, because it takes time and money, and companies usually don't have the money and they don't have the time to do that. So that's a good use of TA money. Also, we talk about blended finance being a key in catalyzing the space. Well, we talked about how in some cases catalytic / philanthropic capital is important, but at the same time providers of that capital realize that once that specific program ends, commercial capital, is not engaged anymore. So the question was, how can we turn this from a short-term offering and provide the right incentives for commercial financing institutions to provide to engage in the longer-term investments rather than just short-lived ones? I hope I did not exceed the 2 minutes.
No, I think that was perfect, and we're pretty much exactly on time now. And so I actually we're going to be closing the session now. So I do want to take this opportunity to thank well all three of you facilitators for these sessions here, as well as all of the other speakers who participated so actively in the full sessions that we've had here today. I think that I mean, certainly we covered many different topics. We know that there's a lot still to be discussed, and there's a lot more to do around these topics. We're really just, I think, at the cusp of moving forward towards something really transformational, and we know that the clock is ticking at the same time. And so I just want to thank everyone once more for your contributions, everyone who participated as part of the audience, And we're going to close now with some final words from Eduardo, who leads the Natural Resources Financing Hub with Palladium, and is going to give us a few closing remarks before we end this this day. So thanks again to everyone, and Eduardo, to you.
Thank you, and I really apologize. For some reason, in the last 15 minutes, I can't seem to access the video. So I've tried 2 different cameras, and it's not working. So I'll stay out of sight. But anyway, I have this very difficult task of trying to summarize and bring together what has been a really interesting conversation, an extremely complex conversation. And so what I'd like to, the way to summarize it, like how to sort of bring this together is, you know, when we combine food and agricultural systems as a conversation, and then of course climate, the impact of climate and climate resilience. You know, the real interesting question is how do food and agricultural systems become part of the solution as opposed to part of the problem, right? So I think today it's assumed and shown scientifically that a lot of agriculture contributes to being part of the problem. But it has huge potential to also be part of the solution. And so this particular group here is interested, especially focused on financing for smallholder farming. And so the really interesting question is, how does one actually incentivize the people closest to the natural resources, the land and the water, to actually adopt sort of practices and technologies that lead to better stewardship of those natural resources, while producing sort of more and better food using less land, water, etc. And this is a little bit the challenge, right? So what we've heard today is about how do we do that through various kinds of partnerships. And on one of the first case study, we're looking at bringing larger scale finance. But again, the interest and the complexity of getting that larger scale finance that often wants to be talking about 25 million, 100 million, et cetera, down to smallholder farmers who today actually have no access to finance at all, much less for new technologies that adopt, you know, for better practices and et cetera, right? And whose absorptive capacity for that finance is in very small pieces, right? So how does one filter that down from these large pieces to the smaller scale finance? And then the other case study was about also then this idea of the financing of, or the science-based, you know, partnerships around science and impact funding to try to get these kind of new technologies into the food and agricultural systems to bring about those improvements in productivity and improved stewardship of the resources. But again, the same applies, right? How does it? There's one thing, and we've, you know, about financing of sort of the ag tech SMEs, if you will, that have these new models and new ideas, and they need that in equity. But the next question is, who's financing the use cases, which means the actual adoption of those technologies by large numbers of small farmers. And so that's the essence of the problem that we've been talking today. And so I think what's interesting is that we talk a lot about systems, but very often we don't talk about financing for systems and for system change or for system strategies. So I think one of the things that came up in the first presentation in particular was, in effect, talking about the importance of developers, right, or catalysts. And I think this came up in some of the breakout sessions, catalysts that are trying to bring together different partners in the food and agriculture ecosystem, if you will, which includes sources of finance. It includes obviously sources of technology and who also have difficulty accessing the smallholder market because of the lack of financing. But interestingly, in that first conversation, they also noted the importance of the relationship now with corporates and the idea that large corporates can be important anchors for helping to actually create some value for new ways of thinking about the food systems, and hopefully also generating some value for eco-services that can also get down to the level of the small farmers and layer on top of the products to actually create more value for those farmers. So I think one of the other thing that becomes very interesting is, you know, I think very often impact investing is looking for this idea of those SMEs that they can invest in, or those growth companies they can invest in. Whereas the question is also how to go from those SMEs in the ecosystem to the large networks of farmers or other SMEs that are connected to them, and which in turn may connect to a larger corporate to help de-risk. Because I think a lot of when we talk about blended finance, et cetera, is a big question becomes who ultimately is carrying the risk, structuring these things, and then putting it together in ways that, you know, again, works for all of the participants in that ecosystem, right? And so what's very interesting is we talked in the discussion room also from, you know, how does one balance impact with returns? But the same applies to the farmer at the other extreme, right? How are they incentivized to adopt these new practices? So one of the things that really becomes interesting in this whole ecosystem approach is also this notion of balancing or aligning objectives. And this is one of the things I came across today, is aligning the objectives between the people that have the technologies and the people that have the money and the people on the ground and the people that want to buy the products, and how do you bring them together into solutions that work for all of them? And that's really hard and it's really complex. And ultimately, that's kind of, I guess, the journey that we're all on, is figuring out that kind of a model of a long-term partnership. Because I think the other thing that came out, and what's very common in food and agriculture, is everything tends to be very short-term and transactional, whereas what we're talking about are very long-term solutions. And so it's about that, trying to create a longer-term joint venture, if you will, among all these partners. And then one where people are building trust among each other rather than the distrust which often exists today, to be able to do that, right? So I think it's really interesting. I think what we all learned, what we all heard today, is that we're all very early on this journey. We're all trying different things and experimenting with different things. It's great that we come together in sessions like this to learn from each other and share these experiences, and hopefully, you know, keep on marching down that road. But I think the other thing that comes across loud and clear is that the interesting thing is that we're talking about small-scale farmers who are micro and tiny very often, and at the other end, we have to achieve scale to move the needle. And you know, it's not just about the large amount of, you know, 100 millions or whatever. It's, if we really want to make a difference, you have to achieve scale. And so that's the really interesting question. How do you go from the micro to the really enormous, high impact type of things that we want to be able to do? And so to me, it was really interesting. It's going to take all of us to figure this out. And I appreciate the opportunity to be part of listening and hopefully contributing also to the kinds of facilities that we're putting together to this whole process. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Eduardo, and thank you for those that excellent recap. I think with those last words, we'll close the session for today. I hope everyone gets some well-deserved rest after this marathon session. So thank you again to everyone for taking part, and have a good day or good night, depending on where you are in the world.